PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. While India were enjoying their extraordinary success at the Olympiad, what was happening to the number one player in the world, Magnus Carlsen? He was there at the Olympiad, not making such headlines as the Indian teams, but he was representing Norway, and he scored a very reasonable 6 out of 8 on board 1. In fact, well, by his high standards, perhaps one would expect more, but actually he only lost 1 rating point. He just about performed to expectations. But he had a few bumps along the way. Now, I'm going to show you the game that he played with white against Vladimir Fedoseev. So, Fedoseev is not an FM, as is shown on the board there. That's just a software glitch. Thank you to everyone that's pointing that out, but I can't do anything about it. So Fedoseev is a grandmaster, born in Russia, represented Russia for many years, but in 2022 he jumped ship and now represents Slovenia. He's a seriously strong player. His peak rating was actually 27.33, so he's pretty good. Nevertheless, Carlsen with white, let's see what happened. So d4, d5, knight f3. And Fedoseev plays c5. I think it's a very interesting move. There is absolutely nothing wrong with c5. It's basically a queen's gambit reversed. Very often black just plays knight f6 here, but c5 is really a very decent move. Of course, if pawn takes pawn, then black is going to recover that pawn with e6. So Carlsen played c4, so that's kind of the approved move against it. And then we could transpose to a Tarrasch with e6, but Fedoseev keeps things a little bit different. Takes on d4, takes on d5, and knight f6. So symmetrical position. Notice he doesn't take with a queen because then white gains time like this. That's an improvement. So knight f6, and both sides take on in the middle. So still symmetrical. And e4, so Carlsen gains a bit of time. Knight f6, but there's not a lot wrong with black's position actually. Bishop b5, so Carlsen is trying to gain a lead in development. Knight c3. But, this is absolutely not bad for black. e5. Hitting the knight. Carlsen exchanges. And white's problem is that after the knight moves, black is able to exchange queens, and that displaces the king. So there are potentially weak squares here, particularly d5. But black also has a bit of play against the king. Bishop g5. So if white were able to exchange on f6 and plant that knight on that beautiful d5 square, white would be strategically winning actually. So that's why knight g4 was played, hitting this, the king covers, and now f6. And the bishop came back to h4. And h5, so that's going to allow the knight to drop back here and black doesn't have to double pawn. So f3, and the knight goes back to h6, so that can just be recaptured with the rook. And in getting rid of this knight, it will allow black's knight into d4 and even gains a tempo against the king. So that's why bishop f2 was played by Carlsen, to cover d4. An exchange of knights, so that's an achievement for black, getting rid of that strong knight. And also, Carlsen doesn't have such control over the d5 square. So you can see after black castles, then this is covered. It looks to me like this is a pretty good outcome from the opening for black. Rook d1, an exchange of rooks, and h4. So this is a very interesting move, allowing the rook to enter the game like this. There's no need to cover the d file. those squares are protected. So this is where things kind of start to take off in this game. So it's clear that this is a threat of some kind. So Carlsen decides to deal with that by playing his king to e4. Well, that's interesting. The king is very high up the board. Now, at the moment that looks fine. The knight is a very long way from attacking the king. The king looks very secure here. There's no light square bishop. And later on, well, that could be a very interesting entry into black's position. In particular, as the king can't cross over the d-file. But Fedoseev has counterplay. Rook g5. And Carlsen plays really ambitiously here. He plays rook g1. So protecting that pawn, looking to expel the rook. He could have played g4. It's kind of an obvious move. And after this, well, push the rook out of the way and recapture here. But presumably he just thought, well, this gives black too much counterplay. And after this, the king is able to cover. Should be equal. Should be equal. You could say this is not the best bishop in the world, but it's not really very significant. So I imagine Carlsen sort of looked at g4 and thought, well, this is probably drifting towards a draw. I want more from the position. Okay, that's so typical of him. And it's the kind of position where there's some kind of positional advantage for white, where Magnus would hope to squeeze. So the positional advantage is that white has control over these central light squares. But Fedoseev reacts very well with g6, so he's challenging white's control over the light squares. So if that's taken, then the king can be checked away, and well, you can see that black has fought back. Those central pawns control lots of useful squares, and yeah, that must be absolutely fine for black. Yeah, if that pawn is taken, then there's going to be rook h6. So Carlsen decided to take on h4. Now, if rook takes, then that knight comes in. That rook looks pretty strange here. So this square is covered and by the knight, and now g4 is a threat. So Fedoseev took on f5 with the pawn, and Carlsen went further with the king. So this is getting very interesting. The rook is threatened. Rook g6. Now, this next move of Carlsen's is quite extraordinary. It's very hard to determine what he had in mind. He could, in this position, I think a prudent move would be to play bishop f2, so that covers this square here. And it's probably about equal. I can imagine that Carlsen looked at that and thought, not enough. So he went on with the king. I mean, this is extraordinary. Deep into the heart of black's position. The thing is, in this position, Fedoseev actually has a forced draw. Which is why I find this move of Carlsen's quite strange. Black can play knight d4, check. The king can't go back because of this pin. So the king has to go forward. Rook g7 check. The rook was threatened. Now once again, king f6. King f6 allows knight takes f3. So king takes bishop. And then this is a draw by perpetual check. Black has no better than this, by the way. Just a draw. So Fedoseev could have drawn straight away with that. I'm sure he would have seen that. But he's ambitious. He played bishop c5. Attacking the rook. which went into the corner. And now knight d4 check. And again, I have no idea what Carlsen was thinking, what his attitude was. We know that he always likes to play for a win. And he came back with the king. In fact, the best move would be to go further with king f7. So this didn't happen, but let me show you what could have happened. So black would take here, white takes here. Okay, let's say black grabs another pawn, and then h4. This is the point. This is an absolute steam train, supported by the rook, supported also by the king and the bishop. In fact, it's still absolutely fine for black. I mean, black has to give up the bishop. I wonder if Carlsen looked at this and thought, well, this is probably going to end in a draw. 3 pawns for a piece. There probably isn't enough here for white to win. I don't know. In any case, Carlsen went back. King d5. Bishop was attacked, so that was covered. Actually, white's position is already a little bit difficult. f4, but Carlsen is trying to stir up trouble. I mean, maybe Fedoseev was in time pressure. I don't know. I didn't see the game live. But typical Carlsen, he's trying to mix things up. So if that's taken, then bishop f2, for example. King d7. Okay, sensible. It's probably best to take here. And then this is very, very complicated. Or this is possible too. I mean, black is a bit better. You know, the king is vulnerable to attack and the rook is pretty good. But that's best for white. But typical Magnus, he's pushing things to the absolute extreme with g4. And in fact, Fedoseev missed an excellent continuation here. He should have played knight c2, threatening knight e3, checkmate. That would have been really sort of strong. But Fedoseev took on g4. This also isn't bad, but nothing like the other move. Knight e4. Okay, so Carlsen has some control here in the centre. And actually, bishop g3, that's still should be fine for white. Even though white's a pawn down, you can see very nice control. That knight does an excellent job of controlling so many important squares. But Carlsen took on c5. I mean, this is a very unusual misjudgment from him. Because in this position, well, there is no doubt that white is worse. This is a strong passed pawn. The king is cut off from that. And the rook is active here. I mean, the computer suggests various ideas for white like this and thinks that white can probably survive this. But it's still not so clear. You know, white is on the wrong end of a draw here, basically. The game went rook c1, king e6, king f5, ready to support the advance. Knight h2, that's another one in the bag. And that g-pawn is now potentially very strong. Knight f1, followed by g3 is coming. So that was exchanged. But this rook endgame is lost. The 2 pawns are simply too strong. The rook can't manage both of them. And the game ended like this. So basically, black's king just shepherded these pawns down the board. And Carlsen can do nothing at this stage. There we go. Once the pawn gets to e2, that's decisive. The rook has to go behind. Black's rook is in the perfect position here. White's rook is behind this one, but you can't manage both these pawns. And all the king needs to do was hide in front of this one. There's no more checks. And then the rook can't stop both those pawns going through. So, well, fair play to Vladimir Fedoseev for finding his way through those complications. But I would love to know what Magnus was thinking when, for example, in this position, when he plunged in with King e6, and a little later on, when having got there, he declined to go further and instead came back. And then he was definitely worse in that position. Who knows? But somewhere his wires got crossed. Anyway, I thought it was a very interesting game. Now, if you're impressed by that king march, then it's not the best. The best king march I've ever seen in a game is from the game Navarra against Wojtaszek from Biel. And I was commentating on this game and I recorded a video afterwards. So I'm going to put the link down there. You'll find it in the comments or the video description. Navarra Wojtaszek from Biel 2013, I think. Let me just check that. I beg your pardon. Biel 2015. David Navarra from the Czech Republic marched his king all the way up the board in a really complex middle game. It was an end game. The queens were off the board, but there was still a couple of rooks and a knight. I mean, it was unbelievable. I won't spoil for you what happened, but do check out that video. It is an unbelievable game. That is the best king march I've ever seen. If you think you can match that, well, let me know. I mean, there are various games in chess history that feature extraordinary king marches, but I honestly think that's the best I've seen. Right, more coming your way on the channel very soon. If you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.